I'm Glenn Tiffert, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, and on behalf of myself and senior fellow Larry Diamond, with whom I co-chair Hoover's project on China's global sharp power, I'd like to welcome you to the first in a two-part series in which we hear and learn from African voices about the issues that are on their minds in their country's increasingly complex relationships with China. Today, in a companion event exactly 1 week from now, we're going to travel from one end of Africa to the other, from the island nation of Mauritius east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean to the Gulf of Guinea off of Nigeria and Cameroon, and to points in between, namely Zambia and South Sudan. We're going to be talking about mass surveillance, infrastructure, corruption, environmental equity, and natural resource extraction. But most of all, we are going to be talking about how African people and nations can strike more equitable relationships with China and other external partners, and how civil society plays a critical role in holding African elites and governments democratically accountable. This is a goal with which people everywhere can identify, and I extend my respect and admiration to the four guests who will guide us in this series for making a difference, not just in their own societies, but in sharing their knowledge so that others in Africa and beyond can carry the baton forward. Before I turn to today's panelists, I want to share a word about how we got here. 1 year ago, Larry and I launched a months-long series of seminars and dialogues that united experts on China from across the globe with nearly 30 journalists, academics, and civil society leaders from 24 sub-Saharan African countries. We shared what they knew and, most importantly, learned from their first experiences. Today and next week, you're going to hear a sample of some of the knowledge they are giving back. All of them are distinguished and courageous, and so it's time for me to get out of the way and to hand the mic to them. We'll start by hearing from Dr. Roukaya Kasenally, who's an associate professor at the University of Mauritius, chair of the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, and a member of the International Advisory Board of the Electoral Integrity Project. She was a Reagan-Fussell Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy in 2011 and a Draper Hills Fellow here at Stanford in 2015. Then we'll be pivoting to Mr. Rueben Lifuka. Mr. Lifuka directs Riverine Ltd, which is an environmental and governance consulting firm in Zambia, and he's the vice chairman of Transparency International's Global Board of Directors. We're also proud to claim him as a 2011 Draper Hills Fellow here at Stanford. The papers they are presenting today can be downloaded from hoover.org/CGSP for China's global sharp power. And as if it couldn't get any better than that, we're honored to have as our discussant today the Honorable, the Dr. Jendai Fraser. Among her many distinctions, she is Dignan Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and former U.S. Ambassador to South Africa. I've spoken too long, and so now I turn the floor over to Dr. Kasenally. Roukaya, take it away.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I'll ask the slides to be put up, and today I'm going to talk about the Mauritius Safe City Project, which is known as the MSCP. Can we go to the next slide, please? So basically, when we talk about Mauritius, I think it's important to situate Mauritius, a small island of 720 square miles in the right smack in the middle of the Indian Ocean. In fact, at the center, Mauritius is at the center of what we call the most strategic sort of zone, geopolitically at the crossroads in terms of the Indo-Pacific, in terms of the commerce routes. So I think Mauritius is seen as a very important sort of a country to be positioned as a partner. It also has a very important exclusive economic zone of some 2.3 million square kilometers. For example, it has a number of territories. One of the territories that it holds is Diego Garcia, which is a disputed island with the Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia. So I think there are some interesting elements tied to Mauritius in terms of its position, in terms of its geolocation, in terms of its crossroads between India and Africa, and within that corridor of the Indo-Pacific that I just mentioned. It also has been part of the traditional partners, being colonized by France and the United Kingdom. It has had both UK and France as important trade partners and diplomatic partners. The US also has a very important trade and diplomatic partner, and India, where around 70% of its people hails from. What's interesting is although China has had very important relationship with Mauritius some 50 years ago when the island became independent, we've seen over the last 5 years, sort of an accrued, sort of an accelerated presence of China. In fact, the Afrobarometer round 8 on Mauritius actually emphasizes that 75% of respondents believe that China's economic activities have a lot to some influence on Mauritian economy. Also, equally, 75% of Mauritians respondents were aware of the loans and developmental assistance given by China. Next, please. So having situated Mauritius, for those of you who don't know Mauritius, I think I'll go straight on to the Mauritius Safe City Project. It actually dropped from nowhere, literally dropped from nowhere. Today we have some 2,500 cameras, which are operational out of 4,000 cameras that have been installed. There is the big question that I started to look at when I was researching on this piece of work was the relevance and utility of such a project. The question that I asked myself, is this really a priority project for Mauritius when we have need for projects and development assistance and on issues linked to, water, to road infrastructure, to hospital, to social housing? Why a Mauritius Safe City? Who pushed for it? That's a big question that, on a number of occasions, I hit a number of brick walls. But after inside knowledge and talking to a number of people, I understood that, this was an unsolicited bid that came from Huawei at the beginning of 2015. And basically, this unsolicited bid came after, there was some discussion around the need to upgrade the CCTV camera of the Mauritian local police. So the question that came up, how did we go from just mere upgrading to CCTV camera circuits to a full-fledged, full-blown Mauritius Safe City project? So as I started to look into and dig into and try to sort of bring the various puzzles together, I realized this project was replete with a number of red flags. Next, please. The first red flag that I encountered was, the issue of surveillance. For me, the Mauritius Safe City was pitched as, security, safety of citizens. That was the official discourse. That was the official narrative that was coming from the government, from the various stakeholders that were involved in the Mauritius Safe City Project. And the official mention of the Mauritius Safe City Project came during the 2016-2017 national budget. There was a small paragraph that mentioned that we shall have a safe city, and that was basically with the aim of bringing about and ensuring security and safety of citizens. But again, as I started to investigate, look into the project, I asked myself whether that was really the case. Was security and safety really the aim and objective of the Mauritius Safe City? For me, as we started to look at the infrastructure, the nomenclature of the Mauritius Safe City Project, we realized that it has a potential for facial and number plate recognition. It has access to sensitive data, right? So again, we start to realize whether security is not in fact a facade for degrees or levels of monitoring, of control, or ultimately whether it would be a full-fledged surveillance type of network. The other element that brought me to a number of questions was the lack of clarity in terms of who really had oversight and control of the data that was being pumped out 24/7, 24 hours, 7 days a week. Was it the Mauritian police? Officially, the Mauritian police is supposed to be the custodian of the Mauritius Safe City Project, right? That's what the government, the Prime Minister mentioned in Parliament. But it seems also that the government online service sort of has access to the database. So a lot of confusion, lack of clarity in terms of who has access to the data, who owns the data, and how can the data be used. So that was something very, very sensitive and important to sort of understand what would happen, in the years to come. And for me, the question that I started to ask myself, are we actually building a digital infrastructure network that in the years to come could become a tool for some form of political control, some form of political repression? Where were the cameras? I mean, it would be very interesting as a next stage to this project to actually do a mapping of where the cameras are. Are they in the backyards of political rivals? Are they in areas which are sensitive in terms of, of certain areas? So I think that's important to understand, where is that digital infrastructure being mounted? And I think I pitch it again, the fact that Mauritius is losing a lot in terms of its democratic credentials. The VDEM report that came out last year in 2020 actually catapulted Mauritius to what we call, among the 10 countries that are actually going down the authoritarian sort of track road. So that, for me, created a lot of unrest, a lot of unease, whether that digital infrastructure was not going to be used for, for more sinister sort of processes around repression, control, and monitoring, and ultimately become a surveillance type of network. Next, please. The other red flag that really brought and grabbed my attention was a total absence of transparency and accountability. In fact, it was completely cloaked in opacity. So the first element that we really saw around opacity and lack of transparency and accountability was the award of the contract. There were a number of clauses of confidentiality that were sort of anchored in the in the Mauritius Safe City project. For example, the contract between Mauritius Telecom, which operates the Mauritius Safe City project, and the Mauritian police, which is the main actor, the contract was not available for any sort of visibility. It was deemed confidential. It was deemed there was a non-closure disclosure clause to that, and no one could actually pierce through that. The second contract that no one had the capacity to look at and to actually have an understanding was a contract that Mauritius Telecom and the Exim Bank of China signed. And here it's important to mention that the loan that the Mauritius Telecom contracted from the Exim Bank of China to run and to manage the Mauritius Safe City project was actually the government of Mauritius acted as a guarantor for that. So the big question was what was being done and how was public funds being used. The other element that also was important to shine light is the overriding of the Public Procurement Act. The Public Procurement Act is very clear in terms of saying that basic principles and procedures will be applied in and regulate the public procurement of goods, of public works, etc. But in the case of the Mauritius Safe City, because the issue of public security or national security was used, this particular Public Procurement Act was actually overridden, right? So which meant that there was, Mauritius Telecom was automatically chosen as the most favorite sort of provider to actually run the Mauritius Safe City project. So the other element also that started to demonstrate, that the democratic credentials of Mauritius was starting to sort of be completely under attack was that, the institutes of oversight, such as Parliament and the National Audit Body, were debarred from crucial information, despite the fact on numerous occasions in 2018, in 2019, in 2020, members of parliaments were actually asked through the parliamentary questions a number of questions pertaining to expenditure, to contract, the aspect of the contract, to the nature of the contract, but very little information was trickled in that particular, the use through Parliament. The same happened for the National Audit Body. Again, those two very important oversight bodies were debarred from crucial information. So again, the lack of transparency and accountability. Next, please. So key takeaways as I round off, for me, I feel, and I have this very sort of unwary feeling that we are laying the ground for what I call a digital surveillance system. And as I mentioned, it has a direct impact on the capacity that Mauritius was a democratic lighthouse. So we see a number of democratic downgrading. We see a number of authoritarian trends happening in terms of civil liberties and political rights being sort of roughshod. The shift of a new type of partnership based on opacity, confidentiality, non-disclosure. So who does it really serve, and who does it really benefit? For me, again, what is it for China? Again, the role of Huawei, was it simply acting as a commercial entity? Big questions that need to be elucidated. The demand and accountability that we need as citizens, as researchers, as stakeholders of different parts of Africa to actually get our national governments and elites to be accountable to us, because this is public money. And last but not least, can the Mauritius Safe City Project act as a cautionary tale? Because we know that there are a number of safe cities being currently rolled out across the continent. So can the case of Mauritius act as an example of things not to be done? Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be very, very happy to take in any further questions at a later stage.
Thank you so much, Roukaya. You've given us a lot to discuss in the discussion section, and I want to let our audience know that we will reserve the last 10 to 15 minutes of the event for audience questions. So line them up and you can begin entering them by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. But without further ado, Rueben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Glenn. And it's a pleasure being here this evening. I am very delighted to speak after Roukaya. She's kind of laid the foundation of some of the things that I'm going to say. So if we go to the next slide. So the Zambian scenario is quite similar to many, the first slide is quite similar to many other countries where we are all grappling with the question of infrastructure development. And Zambia's construction sector has been a vital, plays a very vital role in the economic development of our country. Zambia needs infrastructure in order for it to reach its desired vision of a middle-income country. And we've been implementing a number of large-scale infrastructure projects, including what is known as the Link 8000 road project. This is 8,000 kilometers core roads that have been earmarked for rehabilitation and upgrade. But with such large projects, we need high-level technical and financial capacity of contractors. And this is where Zambia has opened up, so to say, to foreign-owned contracting firms. So if we go to the next slide, it really demonstrates that over the years, China has become one of the major players in the construction sector. Chinese international construction and engineering contractors have become major players. And for Zambia, we've had a long-standing bilateral and diplomatic relations with China. So we've been a recipient of aid and also grants, as well as joint venture funding for projects, large-scale projects, such as roads, bridges, and airports. If we go to the next slide. But as with any sector, the construction sector in Zambia has been fraught with a lot of corruption. And the increasing demand for public infrastructure has also seen an increase in corruption in terms of fraud, bribery, collusion, kickbacks, conflict of interest, among others. And these unethical and corrupt practices affect both foreign and local companies. And the question, therefore, is whether the participation of Chinese companies, the large-scale Chinese companies, has positively or negatively impacted on the construction environment in Zambia. If we go to the next slide, and why do I pick this particular question? I cycle back to the fact that China and President Xi Jinping has embarked on this ambitious campaign to address the deep and endemic corruption problem within China. And China would like to herald itself as having scored successes in a number of the anti-corruption measures. But given China's important position as a major exporter and international development partner, I'm interested to know whether it has played any significant role in combating corruption of its nationals who are working abroad, like the big foreign contracting firms that are working in the Zambian sphere. So if we go to the next slide. For this particular project, I therefore asked two questions. Whether, number one, is there any congruence between the desires of the Chinese regime to promote clean business at home and the practice of Chinese companies, some of them state-owned in foreign jurisdictions? And more specifically, whether the state of corruption in the Zambian construction sector is any different today following the involvement of international Chinese construction companies. Now, let's start from how, and we go to the next slide, how do Chinese companies and local companies participate in the construction sector? In Zambia, there is a requirement by law for the registration of both local and foreign contractors. And this is under the National Council of Construction. And there are 6 grades, grade 1 and 2 being the highest in terms of both scope and the budget of projects to be handled. What you notice is that foreign-owned companies, and particularly Chinese companies, dominate grades 1 and 2. And this has been the case since the contractor registration started in 2005. So inevitably, it means that they dominate the large-scale projects that come into the country. If we go to the next slide, it just gives an overview of the table on the next slide. And I'm sure you could later on look at that. Let's now go to the practice. If we go to the next slide. So with that in mind, Zambia needs investment. Zambia is turned to foreign companies because of capacity and financial skills. What then are the practices of the Chinese companies which either positively or negatively affect the construction sector? When I looked at this, I looked at the entry of Chinese companies to the Zambian construction industry. The entry into overseas market by Chinese construction companies over the years has largely been driven by Chinese state-owned companies. So these were companies that were commissioned to undertake infrastructure aid projects on behalf of the Chinese government. Go to the next slide. What that entailed is that government-endorsed projects enable Chinese contractors or Chinese companies to secure low-cost capital from Chinese banks to facilitate startup costs, mobilization of personnel and equipment. These state-owned enterprises entered the market, but did 2 things. They entered the market, executed the government-funded project, but they also subverted the local environment. And ultimately, a number of the state-owned enterprises have stayed on. They've registered their local presence, so they have a locally registered company, and they are competing with the local small-scale contracting firms within Zambia. So not only do they have access to capital, they have the muscle, but they're also competing with the small companies within Zambia. The next practice, we got the next slide, is the undercutting of competition. So the entry into the Zambian construction sector by the Chinese companies came at the expense of other foreign-owned companies, many from Europe and South Africa. So Chinese companies did undercut local rates and operated on a profit margin of under 10 to 15% compared to the average margin for the construction sector of between 15 and 25%. This was their way of entering into the market and dominating the market, pushing out the competition and becoming the main players, so to say. The third practice that I looked at, if you go to the next slide, has to do with preferential and supplier-driven financing arrangements. Project financing from China quite often comes as a package. And this is a case when you look at large-scale road projects. So the Link 8000 project I talked about, it is not only tied to the funding, it is also tied to the selection and participation of primarily Chinese contractors. So for this reason, if you look at the Link 8000 project, 16 out of the 23 contracts that were tendered were contracted to Chinese companies. But further, the Chinese companies have been awarded numerous other projects which are funded by either Exim Bank or other funding agencies from China. Go to the next slide. But in addition to the loan financing, which comes from bilateral arrangements or Exim Bank, etc., we've also seen a new trend of supply-driven financing from Chinese companies. And this is referred to as contractor-facilitated initiatives. And these were introduced around 2016, primarily to address the difficulties of raising external loans and the shortfalls in local revenues for undertaking what has been termed as politically popular roads and other construction projects. So in the case of Zambia, this is a situation where the Zambian government, being unable to pay upfront for a road project, agrees to a solicitation from a contractor to mobilize financing at competitive rates, and the government commits to reimbursing the funds on agreed terms. Now, in most cases, these projects are not priority. So the Chinese contractors will lobby heavily government officials to agree to put these projects on the plans so that then they can be executed. And we've seen that with toll gates, some of the rules that have been constructed. The fourth practice is non-competitive bidding, and I'll go quickly through this. Go to the next slide. Essentially, the domination of Chinese-owned companies among the higher grades of the contractor registration, as well as this preferential supplier-driven financing, has exacerbated the abuse of single sourcing procurement, which is often non-competitive. So governments will work with one contractor because they've got the money, or they're the only ones within the higher grades of registration. So in some cases, these single source projects are determined without even undertaking a feasibility study. So that makes some of the projects to be overpriced and not necessarily to the benefit of the Zambian populace. So package financing deals which are tied to commercial conditions facilitate the procurement of services from Chinese contractors on a non-competitive single source basis. The next practice, and I'm almost coming to an end, Glenn, it's this unknown terms and conditions of the Chinese funding. Like Roukaya said, the terms and conditions attached to funding from Chinese lenders, whether through major policy banks or state-owned commercial banks or government agencies, are not transparently disclosed. And additionally, we've seen from some studies that Chinese sovereign debt contracts in Africa highlight this inclusion of funding agreements which have confidentiality clauses, as well as a right to cancel the loan and demand immediate repayment under a wide range of circumstances, including political and economic circumstances which may not be related to the project. So all these are problematic. And what do I conclude, therefore, in this paper? One, the involvement of Chinese companies in the Zambian construction sector has brought with it new dynamics and challenges insofar as combating corruption is concerned. So the practice of preferential funding, support from Chinese banks, the tolerance for non-competitive behavior by Zambian authorities, present the Chinese companies with unfair advantage over the local competitors. And the robust anti-corruption campaign by President Xi Jinping that is undertaken at home has not quite reflected in the relationships that China has with bilateral countries such as Zambia. We've not seen the Chinese companies use their size and muscle, so to say, to influence the construction sector. Go to the next slide. So China should influence positive change by promoting transparency in the large-scale infrastructure projects involving Chinese companies by, one, removing non-competitive conditions that are part of financing packages, but also ensuring full adherence by both local and foreign companies, owned companies, to public procurement laws and regulations. And to be consistent with the anti-corruption campaign, the Chinese government should not prohibit the full publication of terms and conditions for all project financing, including bilateral loans. And lastly, in the last slide, the Zambian government should equally improve its own negotiating capacity and ensure the Chinese investment complies with internationally accepted open contracting standards in financing and procurement of large-scale infrastructure projects. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Ruben, for an excellent presentation. And I think that kind of summarizes, or leads us to that pithy saying that transparency and sunshine is the best disinfectant. I want to hand the floor over to Jendai to lead the discussion with our panelists today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Glenn. And thank you, Roukaya and Ruben, for really outstanding papers. I really enjoyed reading them. And I think that both of your papers bring out very common themes. But first, I'd like to just frame it by saying that often when we think about China and its economic footprint in Africa, we do think about it as a positive towards development. Obviously the continent needs infrastructure development to grow, as I think, Ruben, your paper sets out very clearly in terms of the National Development Plan of Zambia. And so we sort of debate this thing at a 60,000 foot, perspective, saying, well, China's doing good because it's bringing infrastructure. African countries want the Chinese to invest because, the West, the US, the West, European countries aren't actually filling that gap, and local companies don't yet have the capacity at scale to fill that need of great infrastructure development. But what your papers do is really allow us to dig into the nature of the relationships and dig into the nature of the infrastructure development project. I like to call it debt financing, China's debt financing development approach in Africa, and really look at the modus operandi and with greater nuance and a critical eye about how, in fact, China is moving so rapidly and what impact that has on society, on the relationship between local or national stakeholders and their government, the relationship between China and these African countries. And then really on as Ruben, you last stated, the international standards for financing these infrastructure, whether digital or transportation infrastructure projects. So one of the things I'd like to just bring out from both of your papers is those points about the nature of financing, the subsidies that are coming from the Chinese government to support often state-owned enterprises, Chinese state-owned enterprises, and that the nature of those contracts are often, as both of you point out, unsolicited. I think you used the term, Ruben, contractor facilitated initiatives. And, Roukaya, you talked about the unsolicited bid where a project to upgrade the closed circuit TV network becomes a full-blown safe city project at $455 million over 20 years, going to a private sector company guaranteed by the government without any citizen participation, basically pushed by Huawei. And so these very sort of projects which are being pushed by Chinese companies onto these national governments that don't necessarily reflect national priorities, I think is really something that needs to be paid attention to, as well as the single source procurement, non-competitive single source procurement, and the timed loans, so that if the Chinese government gives a loan, then you also have to use Chinese contractors, which again undermine local contracting companies, and of course is unfair competition. And then finally, what you talked about with confidentiality clauses, increasing that non-transparency. And so really, in Roukaya, your words, the opacity of the contracts and of the financing arrangements for these big infrastructure projects are leading to, in fact, deeper corruption and opportunities for corruption. And so corrupting of officials in these societies. It also, I think, speaks to the nature of the relationship between the Chinese government and the African governments, in that there's a tremendous asymmetry, right? There's a tremendous asymmetry when most of the financing for these projects are coming from Chinese-owned banks, and these governments are taking it in with all of these clauses which aren't being open to the public, aren't being debated. They don't have as much negotiating power over them. And I think, Rueben, as you said, the Chinese government has, and Roukaya, I think you also said, this fine print where they can just cancel it, cancel the contracts. And so that brings, I think, significant pressure. Well, one of the questions I'd have for you, Rueben, is whether you premise your paper on the idea that Xi Jinping has an interest in stopping these type of non-transparent, corrupting commercial arrangements by reining in Chinese companies, that he has an interest in that to promote better governance and better economic governance anyway, and non-corruption, which he's doing, you said, at home. But what is China's real interest? Does Xi Jinping have an interest in stopping its companies or reining in these companies? Is their corrupting practices hurting a broader agenda that China has in Africa? That's, I think, an important question to ask, which is at the foundation of your premise that China should do a better job. And Roukaya, one of the questions I have for you is, it's very clear that there is a danger of a surveillance city with all of these cameras. And I think your idea of doing a mapping to see exactly where they're located and how they're positioned vis-a-vis, opposition politicians and others and activists from civil society would be extremely important and interesting. And you said that the premise of your paper is, where did this thing come from? It sort of dropped out of the sky, right? The question that I have is, can there be a legitimate national interest in security, right? Clearly cameras can help with, stopping crime, preventing terrorism. What is the picture of security in Mauritius? You related the movement towards this safe cities with a deterioration in the relationship of the Mauritius government with its traditional allies, the UK and the US, over the Chagos Islands and Diego Garcia. And so maybe there was a window for China to get its foot more in, but you also talk about the Prime Minister's party also having a very long-term relationship that goes back some time with the Chinese Communist Party. But you're in a region, we see northern Mozambique, we know the Comoros Islands, you're in a region where there is the threat of terrorism, right? How does that real need for quote unquote safe cities measure up or balance with your concern about a surveillance city? And so then the last thing I would say is that when we look at the modus operandi, again, in more nuance that you guys have provided in this paper, what strikes me is how these contracts are undermining accountability between national governments and their citizens, between national governments and their parliaments, between national governments and the regulatory authorities that are in those societies to prevent this type of corruption. And so it's really corroding. You know, both Zambia and Mauritius have had strong traditions of rule of law. You know, corruption is in every society, but they both have had strong traditions of rule of law. They've had strong traditions of the overturn of governments through electoral processes and nonviolent processes. But yet when you see this, the Chinese government through these financing of these contracts, which are not competitive, non-transparent, and often not even focused on national development priorities, you start to see the erosion of that democratic space and those democratic institutions and those democratic norms, which to me is moving into China's sharp power, which goes from transparent influence to more covert efforts to capture capture elites and export more authoritarian practices. So I'd ask if you could respond to maybe the specific questions and then the general perspective on this question of what are China's interests and how are these contracts or these programs affecting democratic governance in your society and accountability and transparency.
Thank you, Jendai. Roukaya and Rueben, may I suggest that you each address the specific questions that were directed to you individually first, very briefly, and then we can open up to the broader questions that touch on both of your papers. Then Roukaya, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jendai, for those extremely important questions. So diving directly into terms of the security picture in Mauritius, I think Mauritius has always been pitched as a safe place. You know, I mean, one of its most important economic pillar is tourism, and tourism do come when you have a safe island. So I think the island is safe, but over time we've been seeing that the island has actually been has become the crossroads for a number of illicit trading. We know that the island is washed by a number of drug-related sort of networks. You know, there's a whole issue of outgoing issues around, you know, a number of crimes that are happening. But now talking about the rationale behind the safe city that you question or you mentioned, whether, you know, the trade-off to have a safe city can help in terms of furthering the safety dimension of the island. I think there was a particular episode last year or the year, sometime the year before, sorry, where a political agent was murdered, was killed. And when the safe city images were actually solicited, the images were not available. You know, it had disappeared, it was not available on the cloud. And that poses the question of the relevance of a safe city when we're talking about a case of murder and a number of crimes. The issue around safety and security, which you pitch in terms of that region around terrorism and the whole issue around the Indian Ocean islands, I think, you know, recently Mauritius leased one of its island, Agaliga, to India with the understanding that it was actually going to be about safety and security of that region. So I think there is there's an undercurrent, there is a backdrop of the requirement towards safety and security and national security and ensuring that, you know, maritime security. But my question is that this has been used, unfortunately, a little bit as a screen to actually sort of legitimize the presence of, you know, of those security mechanism, which for me can easily be used for more sinister purposes. Because I think that the manner in which the government is moving, the current ruling party is moving, its acceleration towards certain authoritarian traits doesn't really give me enough sort of leeway to believe that security is the overriding mandate here. So I think it can be used for the wrong reasons. That's the first issue around security, the security landscape. The issue around China's general interest in this part of the world and in Mauritius, I think, it's very clear that China wants its presence in Mauritius is linked to the fact that it needs a military presence in the Indian Ocean. China is the only country that doesn't have a presence in the Indian Ocean. India has with Agaliga, at least in terms of the security, safety. The US has it in Diego Garcia. France has it in neighboring Réunion Island, but China's nearest presence to the Indian Ocean is up in Djibouti. So I think there is an interest of actually securing at least some form of presence in this Indian Ocean region, and Mauritius probably is being used to probably access that sort of geopolitical presence. So I think these are the intention behind China's pitch in Mauritius, because don't forget, Mauritius is a small country, and it's interesting to also see that Mauritius, China uses small countries or small points of entries to actually sort of leapfrog. So I think this is my reading of the intention of China short power in this part of the world, and specifically in Mauritius.
Thank you, Roukaya. Rueben?
Thank you very much, Glenn. Just to pick up on the point that Roukaya has made, I think China's interest in Africa is essentially to extend its presence as part of its desire to be a global player. They have extended their commercial interests to countries like Zambia, resource-rich countries like Zambia, and so many others. So number one, the interest is on a commercial line. When we started off after independence, there were social projects like the Tazara, the rail line that was constructed. But over time, the commercial interests have become quite prominent. The problem is China would like to extend its commercial interests in countries like Zambia, but playing by their own rules away from home. So not adhering to public procurement procedures because of the nature of the contracts that are entered to, not being open and transparent to allow for this freedom of expression and the scrutiny that civil society, the media, and others would like to have if they had greater information on the nature of the contracts, etc. So it would like to participate in our economies, but on their terms, under their rules, and not necessarily the local rules. Now, if you look at the fight against corruption in China and what is happening elsewhere, I see a serious policy incoherency here. On one hand, we're being told China is fighting corruption. And one expects that the state-owned enterprises, which meet all the requirements of the Chinese government, including the 8 code, whatever it is that are put in place, will do the same in foreign jurisdictions. However, China's well-known policy is that of non-interference in domestic affairs of recipient countries. That to me suggests that China will be less than inclined to take an active role in fighting corruption. Right by that policy, it is not quite inclined. This hands-off approach seemingly just makes China not too keen to get its hands dirty in dealing with domestic affairs of Zambia or helping Zambia deal with the corruption that we're grappling with, not just in the construction sector, but elsewhere. But what is also worrying to me is that there seems to be this notion that the Chinese companies, like others, would say, well, we are corrupt because we found a corrupt environment. But a corrupt environment should never serve as a justification for one's own corrupt behavior. If Chinese companies are living up to higher standards of probity in the way they do business, this needs to be demonstrated in the norms that they bring to their workspaces, in the way they deal with government officials, in the way they compete for projects, avoiding collusion, avoiding all the unfair business practices. But we're not seeing that. It's almost like going with the flow because we found a dirty environment, so there's nothing wrong with us being part of this environment, and not standing out and being that beacon of hope that we can clean up the sector.
Powerfully said. Before turning over to our audience Q&A, I'd like to give Larry Diamond an opportunity to pose a question.
Thank you, Glenn, and thanks to our extraordinary presenters. These are great papers. I'd like to note that both of you are prominent leaders of civil society, not only in your countries, but more broadly in sub-Saharan Africa. And Rueben, of course, you're vice chair globally of Transparency International. So I wonder if you could speak to the response in your two countries and more broadly. How is civil society responding? And Glenn, if I could just weave in another question, since from Oliver McPherson Smith, since time is running short, Rueben, maybe you could also respond in terms of how Zambian companies are responding to this distortion of the business environment in their country.
Thank you very much, Larry. Civil society has slowly started waking up to the fact that not all that glitters is gold. Yes, we've seen some good work so far as construction activities are concerned, but it's becoming apparent that we need to dig deeper, even in what looks like soft power, having Confucius Center, expanding the broadcasting house in Zambia, helping the media. We need to start understanding, or having the party-to-party exchanges. We need to understand what is driving China. Is it just their good-heartedness that they're coming into Zambia, or there's much more to it? So we're seeing and are working within civil society in the broader advocacy to start drilling down into some of the reasons so as to create a better relationship with China. So that is something that is happening not just in Zambia, but we're seeing that even in other parts of Africa. And even at TI, we now keep talking about the impact of China in the anti-corruption movement. How is China's conduct helping us deal with the international challenges of corruption? Zambian companies, the response has been varied. Some of the Zambian companies have now tended to just focus their energies on being subcontractors to the Chinese companies, whilst others have really put up a strong fight, indicating that the collusion which is happening in this sector needs to be addressed, asking for better terms as governments negotiate for financing for major projects, asking for greater oversight by Parliament over international agreements of this nature. So we're seeing a varied response to the China's dominant factor.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. I think this is an extremely important question. I think in the case of Mauritius, I mentioned that Mauritius has always been seen as this democratic lighthouse in the African continent. So that has always been has created a little bit of what I call a laid-back reaction from Mauritian citizens, always hearing and pandering that we're #1 in Africa, so why bother? We are really doing good in terms of the classification and the very categorizations of us being a functional democracy. But I think over recent time, and that the turning point for me was the Wakasho oil spill, which happened in 2020, which was the moment of wake-up time for a number of Mauritian citizens that after a long time took to the streets in hundreds of thousands to actually protest. And in fact, it was the first protest against government to tell them to get out and to leave. So I think there has been what I call an awakening of civil society. There's this understanding, for example, in the Afrobarometer round of responses, that the 3 in 4 Mauritians or respondents are aware that China is lending loans and giving developmental assistance to Mauritius. So there is an awareness of the presence of China. But having said that, I think China is also really sort of unpacking the big banquet in terms of really nurturing, people to people relationship, investing a lot on networks and scholarships in terms of training of the media, scholarship programs. We have the Confucius Institute. We have a number of, of company related, and Huawei has invested a lot in the Huawei Seeds of the Future, the Huawei, training academy based at the University of Mauritius. So I think there's a whole network that is being weaved in terms of showing that China is extremely open and really sort of, a very given nation to Mauritius. So I think what's happening now with the Safe City, and that has really been an opportunity for members of parliament, for the opposition, for oversight bodies, for the media to actually come together and try and shine light on some of those what I call dodgy projects. So I think there is this understanding, this awakening now. And I think people are now understanding that, that their rights, which have for a long time been taken for granted, their political rights and their civil liberties are starting to be endangered. So I think this awakening is really a positive outcome. And I think what really needs to be happening at this point is a much more organized and coming together of civil society so that the impact is there. And I think it would be also great to sort of see a coalition, not only in Mauritius, but among sort of African countries where you can actually make a greater impact. So I think that's extremely important. And if anything that comes out of China's presence in Mauritius would be that, civil society could really be that moment to really wake up and act.
Thank you for contributing to the awakening.
Exactly. Now, as we pivot to our audience Q&A, we only have a few minutes left, and so I'm going to package some of the questions together and ask you to respond very briefly. But I think this is important. One of our audience members asks, of what relevance is the colonial legacy in Africa with respect to these questions, particularly regarding the traditional relationship that Zambia and Mauritius each have with the UK, the US, and France in particular for Mauritius. To what extent does China fit into that? Is it awakening new neo-colonialist fears? And then secondly, related to that is, to what extent in all of this infrastructure development is there transfer of skills? Are Chinese building these projects? Are they teaching Zambians and Mauritian citizens to build these projects and to manage them? So let me just turn it over to you at that.
So
maybe I could start.
Yeah, go ahead, Rueben.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Rueben, and then I'll take it.
I'll just great. I'll just speak very briefly to this. New neo-colonial these fears. Yes, we've seen this, and it's become a very big political topic. In 2011, the whole political campaign for elections was premised on the fears of the new China, neo-colonialism that was coming through the projects and the work that they were doing. Now, again, it's a magnitude of the projects that Chinese companies are implementing, from schools to hospitals to bridges to roads to nearly everything. I mean, 2014, 90% of the projects that were tendered out were given to foreign companies, and of the foreign companies, nearly 90% of them were Chinese. So that feeling is really being stopped in the number of people. But also it relates to the second question about the transfer of skills. The concern that has been there is that for most Chinese projects, we've seen not only the companies coming to work in Zambia, but also bringing skilled and unskilled labor to work on the projects, with only a few being taken on board from Zambia. And that's why government in the last couple of years has come up with a rule to demand that 30 to 40% of the subcontracting work should go to Zambian-owned companies, because this was not happening in the previous years, and they would like to see more participation of Zambian companies. So it's happening, but not to the extent that one would be happy. Happening in the sense that the skilled or unskilled labor, local labor that works on a project at the airport, really go on and work on other projects, having worked on such a big project. But whether this is structured is not the case. And this is something that has been pushed.
Right. To
Roukaya.
pick, yes, to pick on, I think the similar sort of traits that that Rueben talked about, neocolonialism, sort of. I think China and Mauritius has always had very important relationship. I mentioned that it goes back to 50 years ago when Mauritius became independent, and China and Mauritius recognized China as, and not Taiwan. And so I think that's there. But what is interesting, for example, in the case of Mauritius, is that there is a presence of India. And I have been noting that the presence of India seems to be a way of dampening maybe certain orders of China, because there is what I call a push and pull between China and India, and there is a sharing of big infrastructure projects between India and China. China has done the dams, the airport, the state broadcaster, a number of of road infrastructure, but India has also taken a number of big infrastructure projects, like one that is being done in terms of the light railway. So I think, for me, China is seen as a way as well as negotiating a new partnership, because I did mention that Mauritius seems to be a little bit in the cold with its traditional partners, the UK especially, and the US. So China seems to be a convenient partner when things seem to sour with your traditional partner. But what I think is interesting is that presence of India that can actually be a form of retaining impact on China's maybe soft power in Mauritius. So that's the first thing. In terms of transfer of skill, in terms of big infrastructure projects, they are, they are packaged. So you have the workman force that comes in, that you have the Exim Bank of China that provides the financing like the traditional. So there's no real transfer of skills. And very often when we have in Mauritius, for example, we have a current high level of unemployment, but most of the big infrastructure projects are being manned by foreign workers that are imported in, as part of the package project. The transfer of skills seems to be happening at the people to people. I mentioned about, the Confucius Institute, the training programs around building capacity. So there seems to be a different type of transfer of skill, with one that is built in terms of building the network of China in Mauritius and showing the grandeur and the generosity of China, but at the other stroke of the hand, big infrastructure projects are only manned and dealt and managed by Chinese companies, up to 70 to 80% of the effectives.
Thank you, Roukaya. I can't thank our three panelists, Jendai included, for enough for a really fascinating conversation. I encourage everyone in the audience to download the papers. I've put the link in the chat, but you can visit them also at hoover.org/CGSP for China's Global Sharp Power. And I hope that you'll join us at the same time next week for a second pair of papers. Thank you so much, Roukaya and Jendai and Rueben, for participating today. It's been a pleasure working with you.